Good evening. Thank you for joining us here. So this series of debates were mainly some sort of feedback that comes out of the research. The research that was conducted to produce one book that was already released and another book that will be released soon raised many aspects and many questions, because one of the main ambitions in the beginning of the process was mainly how can we do, in one hand, a survey that keeps these buildings as part of the history of Kuwait on a side, but on the other hand, how can you pursue people and basically apply for the preservation or for a new understanding of these buildings. So these debates come naturally, has the space to discuss on a very open way, and of course was very ambitious what Hamid said about trying to solve all the misunderstandings that exist on Kuwait architectural production. But somehow we hope that these debates can open the discussion of the future of these buildings, but also the discussion of the future of the production of architecture in this country. So I just prepared here a small introduction to the debate. The debate will be composed of 10 questions, and these 10 questions will cross mainly the relation between building, demolishing buildings, what is modern, what is not modern. And these are the questions we are trying to understand, and for that we have Roberto Fabbri that has an extensive research work, and on the other hand, NASSER ABULHASAN that has an extensive practice work. So everybody knows what was Kuwait. This old Kuwait may fit all inside Mutana building today, and that's actually something weird to think about. But all this idea of remodernizing or modernizing the city came out from an ambition that, of course, results of a certain affluence that emerges after the achievements of oil and the discovery of oil. But it's also the idea of searching for a certain comfort. And the search for comfort is being always present in any new building, in any new idea, and still today, what people want to achieve when they demolish their old house and build a new house. So the idea of comfort brought to this geography the idea of a green city, the idea of a covered area, air-conditioned buildings, but everybody wanted to do this as fast as possible. And of course, that basically erupted on a certain clash between the old and the new. A very interesting text from Sayyid Karim on Al-Imara magazine in 1945 talks about this relation between old people, new ideas, and old ideas. So it actually brings up a metaphor saying that on the left side of the Nile we have the young, on the right side of the Nile we have the old, and both together will build a new country. So this reveals also an extreme optimism that was transversal to the old region. So all these buildings that everybody relates to, the 1950s and the 1960s, that have this kind of extravagant forms, are mainly buildings that reveal an extremely optimism. There is the ambition to do something that impresses people, that is big, that is new, that challenges technology, and that basically brought up a new understanding of building technology, which was the main driving force for the construction of Ahmadi and for the first buildings that were built. Of course, contracting universe is extremely related to this, as well as the manufacture and the production of new materials. So the idea of challenging the building itself is also something that's still present today in the buildings that, for example, AGi is doing. There is always this sort of ambition in opposition to the idea of the traditional housing. And at the end of the day, the clash between these two is on the idea of comfort, is on the idea of living with certain standards. Of course, that was also transferred into public domain and into public buildings and common buildings. So the idea of performative space was always present. And at the end of the day, Kuwait is today a place that keeps building on this idea of optimism. So everywhere you go, you see sites under construction at a larger scale, at a smaller scale. There are palm trees being planted, viaducts being built, and new cities being rendered in computers, as well as new islands now. So this discussion today is about what are the things behind all this unbelievable world. So I will invite NASSER ABULHASAN and Roberto Fabbri to come to their podiums. So to start the discussion, I will just read a small paragraph that contextualizes the 10 questions that will follow. The act of building and rebuilding is part of a post-oil communal behavior in Kuwait. The need for building something new, or the fascination with building something modern. What is modern? The word modern encompasses the idea of demolishing something old in order to make space for something new. This principle that leads us to demolish old buildings in order to create certain new modern buildings still exists. But at what expense? So the first question for both, we will start with Roberto and then we will follow with NASSER. So the first question is, the advent of development in the region attempted to supersede outmoded building traditions and create a mindset of tabula rasa that evacuates history as a necessary instance upon the idea of modernization. Do you think modernization and development will remain to this day associated with the idea of tabula rasa?
Good evening, everyone, first of all. No, I do not think that modernization and development is necessarily associated to this day with the idea of tabula rasa, and I don't think it was in the past. If we want to consider it as a deliberate approach to planning or a planning tool. In the 900s, there has been some research and theoretical approaches which implies the notion of it as a consequence. And we can easily draw a line from examples from the past, such as Plan Voisin of Le Corbusier 1925, or the experiments from Superstudio 1969 to the more recent Kohler's strategy of emptiness to answer the failure of urban planning for the contemporary cities in his word without attributes. But I don't think that any of these motivations were behind the systematic demolition that happened in Kuwait, and they're still happening somehow nowadays. I would say instead that the reason is more pragmatic than methodologic. The fact is that the demolition is convenient in Kuwait nowadays, and it was convenient in the past, because preservation is a practice that required deeper studies, wider knowledge, more time, and more financial resources.
Thank you. NASSER.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us here. Just in basic terms, what we're trying to explain here is actually from our practice point of view. So my answers are all related to what we believe in the practice. That's the first part. The second part is, I want to apologize, there's some images that we try to note who the credits came from. Some we couldn't find, but we try to maintain most of that. In brief, as we all know, the demolition happened throughout the city after the oil was found, and it was actually a mean to disperse wealth throughout the whole countrymen. From our point of view, that does not exist anymore, and it doesn't exist because looking at this image, whatever you want to build right now, there is actually a home, and which is the majority of the countries actually has houses which were developed throughout the urban sprawl, and the urban sprawl happened through a mentality that came to us from the West, which is the Garden City movement, which actually allocated highways, residential neighborhoods, homes within the neighborhoods that actually had people living in them. And right now, people feel that this is their only right to develop is on a plot, and the plot has to be within a particular dimension. So majority of the development that is happening in Kuwait currently and will continue to happen, forget the city. The city is actually a small part of the country. The rest of the country is actually what we see. And the future development will continue to be on virgin land.
Thank you. We go now to a second question. I forgot to mention, by the way, excuse me, that you might have noticed that each image, each slide refers to each one of our intervenients. So each one supports his own argument with one slide. So the second question, in the old and new villas of Kuwait, post-oil neighborhoods, one can see alienation emerging as a result of the individual who was forced to reconsider him or herself in relation to a modernized and developed city. Is this alienation a simple existential concept reflecting a modern society or a product of new living conditions that were brought by the post-oil planning and social policies and practices?
I don't see alienation, while I do see individualism. And I can argue that the initial decision to use extensively the single-family villa as the main typology to build residential neighborhoods by default trigger an individual approach to the city. A villa is by definition a public expression of the owner's social and cultural status, so Kuwait is not different in this case from the rest of the world. In a urban environment, normally you would expect to see diverse variety of typologies. The reduction of this diversity into one single typology implemented of a very single rectangular plot, repeated in the majority of the neighborhood units, also similar to each other, trigger the natural aspiration of being different.
Thank you. Finish?
I just have a quote.
You have more
just
30
to
seconds.
to just justify the image is there. And it's a quote from Adolf Loos and his book Ornament and Crime, where often the owner, the urge for simplicity is equivalent to self-denial. And this is what I think is behind the eclecticism of the villa typology in Kuwait.
Thank you.
Just to complement what Roberto said and to continue to the earlier point, the Garden City movement, which we talked about earlier, allocated individual plots to each of the family members, and that was by law. Part of the welfare state is to give that property. Unfortunately, what that master plan and the political agenda of giving properties to the Kuwaiti citizens actually alienated the people from their neighbor, alienated their people from the family and the people within their household. As an office, what we do is actually we have embraced alienation. And the way we've embraced it is actually with examples similar to this, where we actually start to create within these homes a new environment, an environment where it fosters a closer family relationship, start to have a relationship to the outdoor, consider the environment extremely well. So in one way, we know that there is an alienation between the neighbors, and that's part of the master plan. And from our point of view, we have to preserve the privacy issue, which is an issue that has been here in this country historically, and we will continue to address it. But we try to reinterpret it in the projects that we do.
Thank you. The third question. Following the major resettlement of population outside Kuwait walls, a rising bourgeoisie began to restrict their social activity to domestic confines, since the home was the quintessential bourgeois world, for in it, and only in it, could the problems of contradiction of his society be forgotten and artificially eliminated. These words, borrowed from Charles Baudelaire on the transformations enforced by Haussmann in Paris, can still be applicable to the phenomenon of contemporary domestic architecture in the region, apart from planning and regulation guidelines. Or the household tradition of an introspective architecture remained at the center of the typological discourse. Actually, this question follows on your points. So perhaps here I will do an inversion and I will start with Nasser.
Be free.
Sorry.
So to elaborate even further, as you could see, the outcome of the master plan and the outcome of the welfare state, the outcome of the garden city movement actually produced what we could see, which is the vast number of housing projects, each one with no relationship to each other, with limitation to what are the setbacks that have been given. And unfortunately, what this has created, actually created a society that is driven purely through highways, through cars, through minimal interaction of neighbors. And that, unfortunately, is the biggest problem that we are actually having to deal with. There are certain, I'll borrow some of your images. There are certain positive that had to come out from actually looking at these neighborhoods, because there are parallel spaces that started to be created where people get to actually interact, similar to malls and other spaces similar to them, which are not so much considered as democratic public spaces. But I think if we need to readdress this issue, we have to change the master plan, change the outcomes of the master plan, because this is what's actually draining us right now.
Thank you.
Well, I totally agree, and I will keep insisting on the same point of the previous answer. I mean, the problem is typological, in my opinion. I put this image of the Diwaniyah because this is a very interesting local space of interaction that is unique, but at the same time was never developed into a proper typology, right? These are the kind of spaces that we can, or architect like AGi can use as an archetype to develop new typology of architecture in Kuwait and contradict the master plan that wants boxes all over the place. And I have a question for Nasser. I'm spoiling the plan because it was actually the conclusion of my answer to this point, which I'm aware that AGi is very interested in this sociological study about the domestic scape, and I heard that you commissioned a research on that. And can you give us a couple of insight about this study? Because that will be, a very interesting step forward.
I think he will be able to answer that in the next question, because the next question is exactly about that.
Very good.
Right? Do this domestic design and build processes transcend their physical limits? Right? Do these serve as a model for the production of city in general and public buildings in particular?
I'll actually answer this question over two independent answers. One of them is actually the current constraints within the master plan has forced the people to actually break every rule that they have within the master plan. So within the boundary line of an individual property, people are asking to build apartments, are asking actually to have spaces for rent. They're actually trying to have multiple families rent within a single family house. So that typology actually is becoming a new form of living within a single family house. So since that typology should disappear, and I think what we should do is mandate a different way of living, get new set of rules, allow people to build, but let's constrain them. Let's incentivize them to try to say, okay, if you want to build in this fashion, which is a different way of living, let's actually regulate it. And through that regulation, it will allow the equality, and I think it will enhance the way people are living.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I have to shrink my answer here because it's definitely too long. But and I answered this question on from a different angle, from the angle of the public housing projects, and that's why you have one of the projects from Moretti from 1969, because this is another important point. Public housing project can work in this idea of creating new typology for a more dense urban fabric. And I'll take 2 minutes to explain an experience that I had when I was invited to the Faculty of Architecture here, the College of Architecture, at the course of Professor Asil, who is also today in the room. And Asil students were working on Sawaber, and we all know that Sawaber is going to be demolished very soon because probably there was no project able to save it. Now, what I find interesting is the students, still students, were working on proposal to avoid this demolition and a theoretical approach, and they interviewed the resident of Sawaber, and what they came out with was several opinions and complaints, one of which was that the units were not big enough. So I was surprised because the entire complication of Sawaber were reduced of a problem of how many square meters we need to build a formal living, a diwania, room that is enough to accommodate this much people. So it's like recreating a villa in a social housing project, which is a contradiction in terms. Because in a social housing program, common spaces should be in common. Now, I mean, I'm not here to criticize students' work. I mean, it was a very interesting debate, and I learned a lot about how people understand the needs of spaces in Kuwait. But probably we have to start looking at Sawaber or other examples like that, or even Moretti work to change the typology of Kuwait.
Thank you. So now we will go, I think, more into what an architect does. So the fifth question, which is the architect and its production, so the act of designing and build buildings, in the region remain to this day as a sign of modernization and development. And actually, the architect still represents that. How can others look into the architect as an agent of modernization while preserving and repurposing buildings, and to develop as a mature state of recognition of cultural and traditional values through the preservation of these buildings? So how the architect can now advocate for the preservation of buildings if everybody has been looking at the architect as someone that can bring the newness? Roberto.
Well, the architect did that in the past years. He replaced the old with the new, but it was not a one-man band show. I mean, and I'm sure that was a decision taken together with real estate developers and contractors and owners and all that. But even so, with this said,
but the architect was the advisor for the new.
Right. So the real question, in my opinion, and how we should educate architects in order to be ready to advise correctly the owner or the clients, and later to have sufficient reading tools when a rehabilitation project comes on the drafting table. Because too many times we have seen architectural history excluded from curricula in schools and conservation not taught as a course or an elective course at best. So I think that we have to start studying conservation before, being ready to address our clients. And I mean, there's many distinguished professors from Kuwait University here, and this is something that I would like to discuss with you. Go ahead.
Just in parallel to the discussion which was discussed earlier, but as you all know that the built environment isn't the responsibility of the government by itself. It's actually the responsibility of the citizens, the developers, and the change should be demanded by all. And in order for this change to happen, we have to redefine what is actually the role of the architect, the urban designer, the landscape designers, because unfortunately, I think that role has misconception, because the role of the advisory, which has been looked at historically, remains until now with diminishing of the quality of the advisors and reducing actually what you hear from the advisor. So that figure does not work in these contemporary days in how it should be actually, especially in this part of the world. I'll just give you an example of actually a development that we worked on last year which was a competition in Qatar. It was for courthouses, and the important idea of actually developing this courthouse, we wanted to ensure that the people of Qatar could look at this courthouse, and the courthouse being the umbrella for justice. So this is why actually we literally hovered the building, created an open space underneath it that is open to the public, and that began to implement the idea of justice. Of course, this is just a hidden agenda that we had in the project, but what's important is the architect has a social and a political role that could be played, and I think it has to be played in hand with the politician, in hand with the citizens, and that is the only way for us to develop better quality urban spaces and better quality architecture.
Thank you. So, tradition, when associated with construction material and methods in architecture, is openly contested and viewed as an obstacle to pursue the new or the modern by architects and owners. What do you recognize as a building tradition in the Gulf region today, since you were talking about Qatar, Nasser?
I think, can we go to the...
Sorry.
I think just to go forward, in our practice, we don't study the environment only. We study the social environment. We study the response of people towards the environment. We actually look at traditions, but we try to reinterpret traditions. So from our point of view, readdressing in our practice the modern ways of building by trying to learn from the past. This is an example that we have used for a competition that we won 2 years ago for the General Department of Information System here in Kuwait for the Ministry of Interior, where the building actually held all the technology of the Department of Information System in the basement. So, and then at the upper part of the building where it's actually an IT-driven building. So what we did is we looked at the idea of security being the foundation of this project, and we reinterpreted the landscape itself and the outer walls of the project to show how strong this motif was. And that we never actually borrowed from the past. We actually learned from it. And when we're looking at the future, we actually was representing the idea of transparency, innovation, technology by looking at the transparent part of the upper part of the building. And in totality, I will not say this is an old building, a new building, a modern building. This is a building that is being built now. So it's actually contemporary to its root, and it's in alignment to the end user's goals and ambitions.
Thank you.
Well, I would say that tradition is a false friend. And I'm always confused when we have to discuss about it. What is tradition in the Gulf region? What is tradition in Italy? I have no idea. Is bricks in Rome? Is marble in Tuscany? Is the concrete that is spreading everywhere? I have no answer for this question. And I cannot see a specific traditional way of building in the Gulf and in Kuwait, because when it comes to tradition, it's a tricky thing. This building here that is well known, it's considered a traditional building, but at the same time was completed in 1954, at the very beginning of the modernization of Kuwait, and is suspended between the past and the new. I mean, its shape could resemble something that is traditional, but its shape and its typology and its construction methodology is not traditional. This building is made of concrete blocks, bearing walls, but these concrete blocks, it's basically a traditional way to use a modern material. So is it traditional? It's something we can refer to. It's not a courtyard house, so it's not really traditional. It has no the typology of a traditional building of the Gulf, but everybody considers that traditional. So I'll leave you without an answer.
So then we will continue to the mainstream idea of traditional, which is the use of traditional motifs that's still being recognized by the majority as a way to achieve the sublime rather than the way to respond to the environment and context. Architecture remains in the region associated to this idea of aesthetics on a way to obtain a sublime. Again, the idea that the architect will bring something unique. How does your practice respond to that, Nasser?
I need someone to define what tradition to me, so I think we should have another discussion about it at a different time. We don't look at traditional motifs in any way because we're not motif-driven practice. Actually, what we look at is, this is an example of a project that was built 2 years back here in Kuwait. It's the Slaybikhat Clinic, and we needed to shade. So what we did, we developed a screen. The screen had geometrical patterns. Yes, geometry has been studied since the beginning of humankind. So is the screen a traditional element? You could question that. Is geometry a traditional element? You could question that. But the act of privacy, or the act of the response to privacy, the response to shade, I think from our point of view is what we're reacting towards. How do we react towards it is depending on the problem that we have and how our practice deals with it.
Thank you.
Well, my practice doesn't respond to this at all. And I don't see the use of geometrical pattern schemes as an appropriate way to ascribe architecture to a certain context. It has to do more with ornament and decoration. And again, I will stand with Adolf Loos, as in picture number 2. There are so many layers of specificity in Arab and Islamic architecture that reducing everything to a geometrical motif, like in some building there we are seeing recently, I think it's a little bit too obvious for me and too simplistic. So I try to stay away as much as possible, and I leave to artists such as Lulu Alamud or to Zerikraf, for example, to study this problem and to have a better pattern than what I can achieve.
Thank you. So taking you further deep, do you consider architecture as a framework for sentiment, emotions?
It depends on sentiments you are referring to. If it's the designer's sentiments or the client's sentiments, no. Because I see architecture as a production of space for common good or public interest. So if this architecture is, the idea of representing the sentiment of some of the actors involved, that is tricky because it can easily reduce the discipline to a problem of self-expression. And I'm completely far away from that. But architects do consider sentiments important. In this picture, murder architecture from Aldorossi, it's an expression of that. I could have put millions of other images to refer to that. But I consider a tricky position, a very dangerous position.
Thank you.
If you look at the image that we have placed up here, for me, this is what sentiment is all about, which is a reflection of our current master plan, the current conditions where, regardless of how hard we try, all our bedrooms are actually facing the neighbors. All our living rooms are facing the neighbor. And that creates an unfortunate reaction to a master plan that we have actually adhered to and continue to work under for the past 50 years plus. So I plead everyone to look actually at the issue actually in a much more global point of view, and to try to avoid or stop what we have been forced to do in the past 50 years.
Thank you. Looking at the exhibition over there, and at all those buildings that are part of the survey, and that were not demolished and some of them are abandoned, what do you think that remains the meaning of these buildings in the city? Can one look into it as a monition perpetuating memory of the past? Is the state of ruin or abandonment an aesthetic value of the physical space? Or can the repurposing of any of these buildings preserve emotions and sentiments that can still preserve values of the past, projecting it into the future?
Well, it's me. I don't look at the heritage in this way. And the memory of the past, in my opinion, is not the correct lens through which architects and designers should look at the heritage. Because architectural heritage is not only a trace of previous time, but is also a component of a living city. The risk is to transform them into monuments or icons, which are by definition frozen elements in the middle of a changing landscape. So this can lead to a sort of musealization of the city, which is one of the typical approach for those who I call the conservation Talibans. their position is at the opposite end of the scale from those who are for demolition. But the result is basically the same, is a dysfunctional understanding of the meaning of a building as a living component of the city. We have to accept transformation of this type of building, and we have to teach and learn how to practice rehabilitation in a compatible way with the Kuwait environment.
Thank you.
Again, to complement what was said earlier, I don't think our focus should be only on the buildings. Because if you look at the city, this is a part of the city that we could see, and this is a relatively quote-unquote denser part of the city, still empty. There's no character to the streets, no character to the sidewalks. A lot of these buildings have been here. Some of them are in the book. Some of the 4 or 5 images, 4 or 5 buildings are here within the book. Regardless if we try to preserve them and introduce a new program in them and try to improve on the quality of the structure, the MEP, add a new program with it, it will still be an independent building. What we need to relook at actually is the whole city. And if we begin to do that, a new program could be introduced in each of these buildings. And then through that, the whole city will be regenerated. We cannot only simplistically focus on standalone buildings.
Thank you. However, you didn't answer, none of you, to the question, which is basically more emotional, but today we have 2 extremely pragmatic speakers. So we will never go into, might be the public will bring that discussion into here. The repurposing of an existing building with other functions, which go back to actually both of your opinions, replaces its initial memory by a second significance, which eventually resides in the disappearance of the memory of the building itself. So something that was an hospital, we transform into a museum. In 20 years will be remembered as a museum and not anymore as an hospital. So that indulges the building in a process that many people are arguing if we are talking about preservation when we do such. So however the architectural dimension of many of these post-oil buildings, including its construction material and method, or even typology, are transversal elements to the use of function, how and what should we preserve in these buildings?
Well, I will start by taking function out of the equation. I don't think that function is an important way to describe this building because function changes across the years. So the importance of a building, the nature of a building is independent from the function that is hosting in that particular moment, right? So the fact that it's repurposed, it doesn't really make any difference in my point of view. And actually, as designer, we should try to do buildings that are able to accommodate different functions along the lifespan of a building. It's not easy, but that will be a better situation in a moment in which this building has to be repurposed. Right, now looking at the past, your question is how and what should we preserve? How, the question is simple, adaptive reuse. We have to study the problem and come with a project that can be compatible with the nature of the building itself, despite the function you had before. What? I don't have the answer for that because we need more studies. We need more MAK books at a different level of understanding from local production. And we need, what Nasser was saying before, an holistic approach to the city to identify which buildings are important for the citizens and for the city itself, which are in the strategic position, the location, and not only their architectural quality.
Thank you.
To complement again to the earlier discussion that I was mentioning, what we need to preserve is actually the individuals. Because if we start with individuals, we'll begin to actually look at the building, look at the city in a complete different perspective. Because the individuals keep changing. Their minds, their reactions, their understanding, the physical space around them, the demand for physical space around them, even their economical conditions begins to change. So if we look at the individuals from the behavioral point of view, from the social point of view, from the economical point of view, I think the city will immediately begin to react to them. And we will continue to react to the individuals as they grow, as the city begins to expand. And I think that is the key. I know there are some amazing buildings around in Kuwait. A lot of them have been documented in this book. And they were very significant buildings at the time they were built. Unfortunately, and we know we all suffer from this, a lot of them were not even built to spec. The material qualities were poorer than originally accepted. A lot of the architects disown these buildings, and they stand there as monuments that have been, or as buildings that have been looked at, studied, experienced. But what we lack is actually the appreciations of the building towards their built environment. And if we start there, I think the built environment will naturally improve.
Thank you.